Good evening and welcome to the third annual Forum of the Center for Global Business, The Future of Everything. Please note that this event is being recorded. My name is Marina Augustidis, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Global Business here at Maryland Smith. The center is the hub and driver of global education and activity at the Smith School. The mission of the center is to connect the diverse members of the Smith School community to the world and the world to the Smith School. To provide these members and partners with opportunities to gain a global mindset and build international business skills, and to serve as a Maryland resource center for companies seeking to take their goods into the global marketplace. The center is also one of 15 nationally recognized centers across the country to have been awarded a Title VI grant known as CIBE or CYBER. The CIBE grant is administered by the U.S. Department of Education and supports many of our activities, including this event this evening, and expands our mission outside the campus to industry and other academic institutions. The annual forum is an event that occurs every spring and brings together distinguished voices from the academic, policy, diplomatic, and business communities to speak on a different theme each year. I'm honored to give a special welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Mauro Guillen, and to the center's academic director, Dr. Kisleya Prasad, who will take us into a discussion after I finish a few more opening comments. Before I introduce our guests, please let me share a few tips to help us move smoothly through the next hour. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. It will be made publicly available via the school's website and emailed out to all participants afterwards for future viewing. For optimal viewing, please select the grid view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Additionally, click on View in the toolbar in the upper left-hand corner, and then click Hide Non-Video Participants. Following the discussion, we will open up the conversation for questions from the audience. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to send your questions to the host in the chat function, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the order they are received at the end of the discussion. Additionally, if you're an undergraduate student seeking credit for iSmith, a QR code will appear on a slide at the end of the event. Please be sure to scan this to receive your credit. Once the event closes, you'll see a pop-up window with a link to take our 2-minute survey about the event. We appreciate your taking the time to complete that, as your feedback is critical to the development of future virtual events. And if there are any technical difficulties on our end or yours, we thank you in advance for your patience. Please also continue to engage with us on Twitter at Smith Global Biz for information on other upcoming events and programs, including the Global Marketing Virtual Internship Program, the Maryland Global Consulting Program, and Maryland Business Adapts. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Dr. Mauro Guillen is the author of the book 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. Dr. Guillen currently holds the Zanman Professorship in International Management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and was recently appointed the next Dean of Cambridge Judge Business School, which will begin in December 2021. From 2007 to 2019, he served as the director of the Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies, which led him to receiving the Aspen Institute's Faculty Pioneer Award. He's also received numerous distinctions, such as the Rockefeller and Guggenheim Fellowships. His research has been featured from the New York Times to The Economist, and his most recent book, of which we will discuss today, was published in 2020 and is a Wall Street Journal and Financial Times international bestseller. We will plan to provide information on how you can purchase his latest book in the chat in our follow-up communications. Lastly, and certainly but not least, our moderator and academic director of the Center for Global Business, Dr. Kisleya Prasad. Please joining me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Thanks, Marina. Welcome, everyone. It gives me a great pleasure today to welcome Professor Mauro Guillen to the Smith School. We're going to be discussing his new book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. The book's, as Marina mentioned, it's a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and it's also on the Financial Times Best Books list. I read the book a couple of weeks back, and I have to say, it's a wonderful book. The book outlines the major trends of today and shows how their interplay will determine our future. Some of the trends will feel familiar, but when Mauro gets into a discussion of the nuances, you will find yourself frequently surprised. It's a complex and multi-layered book. There's the top line trend and there are nuances. There's fascinating data, but multiple powerful stories that bring the numbers to life. It outlines challenges we'll face, but illustrates the kind of thinking that will allow us to rise to the challenges. So 2030 is not so far away. We will be living and working in that future and need to prepare for it today. So this book is going to be a useful guide for how we do that. So let's get started. Mauro, let me begin by asking you first, what made you think of writing this book? And is there a backstory?
So Kislaya, first of all, thank you so very much for inviting me. It's really an honor. I follow the research that comes out of the center that you direct, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you, with your students, with other colleagues from the University of Maryland and beyond. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was making presentations, sometimes in class with my students, sometimes outside with corporate audiences, and I was detecting a relatively high level of stress. People were thinking that too many things were changing in the world, and they really didn't have a way of, essentially getting their arms around that. And so I decided that it would make sense for me to do a little bit more research on it and to try to identify exactly what are the kinds of trends that are reshaping the world, and then offer people a guide to essentially be able to navigate all of those transformations. And that's how the book came into being. I mean, it was 6 years worth of research, and I essentially was trying to offer my audiences a way of understanding what's going on, because I strongly believe that we're going through a major transformation, and that both corporations and individuals need to get ready for it.
So let me ask you about the title then. Why did you pick 2030? And I note that it's not some safe, distant future, but it's like right around the corner. Can you give us a big picture view of why 2030 and what are the forces that will collide, as you say in your title page, by then?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it was an empirical decision. That is to say, I started to crunch numbers. I started to make projections into the future. And I realized that the year 2030 was pivotal. So in the process of doing research, for example, I determined that Africa would become the second biggest region in the world by population, exactly in the year 2030. Also that year, South Asia, which includes India, was going to level off in terms of this population growth. But I also found that by the year 2030, the largest consumer segment in terms of purchasing power in the world will become people above the age of 60, right? And also by the year 2030, I forecasted that women would be owning more than half of the net worth in the world. So for some reason, many of these things were reaching a critical level, or there was a turning point in the year 2030. And that's why I decided to call the book 2030. Now, my only regret, Kislaya, is that, as you know, the pandemic has accelerated things, right? Technological adoption is being accelerated, all sorts of things. And although I published the book 5 months into the pandemic and I was able to make some changes, my only regret is that instead of calling the book 2030, maybe I should call it now 2028, because the future that I describe in the book, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, is now arriving faster, because this pandemic accelerates trends.
That's fascinating, because one of the audience questions that was submitted was precisely that how has the COVID pandemic changed the timetable? So it's actually made it quicker. So let's maybe as I said, the book's really complex, so it's hard to take a linear path through it. But maybe I'll follow the progression of chapters, and you begin with 2 chapters, one called Follow the Babies, and then Gray is the New Black, which discuss the major demographic trends, some that you just mentioned. And so I'm going to ask you, could you summarize for the audience what's been going on with the world's population and the significance of this? And you've alluded to Africa, but could you get into that in a little more detail?
Oh, absolutely. So Follow the Babies is all about the methodology that I use for trying to anticipate what global consumer and financial markets are going to look like by the year 2030. And essentially, my assumption, the assumption that I make is that the young consumers of the future are the babies who have been born in the last 10 years and the babies that will be born over the next 10 years or so. So following the babies, understanding how many of them will be born in which parts of the world, gives you a very good first approximation to the future of consumer markets and financial markets. Now, specifically about Africa, I think you are referring to perhaps what I believe is going to be the biggest change. I think Africa is quickly becoming the latest frontier in emerging markets and in the global economy. And the reason is, of course, population growth, but it's not just population growth. It's also the growth of the middle class. So the middle class in Africa is still incipient. It's quite small. It's no more than 20% of the population, but it's growing. And if that process continues, then Africa is not just going to be a place where foreigners go in to get oil and to get minerals. It's going to be a consumer market. And when I ask Chinese leaders, business leaders, and I'm sure that you also do that as part of your activities at the center, when I ask them, why are so many Chinese companies investing in Africa? The response is because of the consumer market that is emerging. They want to be prepared for that. And so I think because of this population dynamism, Africa is going to be a very dynamic part of the global economy over the next, I would say, not just 10 years, but 15 to 20 years.
And at the same time, you mentioned that China is now paying somewhat for its one-child policy, that Asia is where everybody is rushing, and they're looking to Africa right now, as you point out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things I found interesting in that chapter is you mentioned that should affect our view of immigration. And could you maybe expand on that?
So, Kislaya, I guess you and I are biased, right, when it comes to thinking about immigration, because obviously both of us have benefited immensely from the opportunities that the United States offers to people like ourselves who are willing to work hard and are willing to study and to, make progress in life. But look, I think the phenomenon of immigration or people moving around the world, it's just a direct consequence of the fact that we have some parts of the world where a lot of babies still are being born, and other parts of the world where fewer babies are being born. And also we have very big differences in terms of the job creation capabilities of economies. So some economies, like the American economy, for example, is like a job creation machine, right? I mean, at all levels, for both low-skilled jobs and highly skilled jobs, the American economy produces or it generates many jobs. Now, as you know, the debate is as to whether immigration is good or bad. And I'm not going to argue that, unlimited immigration is good. Of course, there has to be some, order in it. But think about, since we're all talking business here today, think about how many companies in the United States have been founded by immigrants. Think about all of those companies in the Silicon Valley that have been founded by immigrants. I mean, Facebook, I'm sorry, not Facebook, but Tesla, Google, several of these technological powerhouses have two things in common. One is that they have changed the face of the economy. And the other one is that they were either founded or co-founded by immigrants. And look, this is a statistic I find mind-boggling. Of all of the companies in the Silicon Valley that have gone public, about 1/3 have an Indian, somebody from India, as either a founder or a co-founder. I mean, that's staggering, right? And lastly, let me point out, now we're in the middle of a pandemic. If you take a look at the doctors and the nurses who work in the United States, about or between 25 and 35% of them were born outside of the United States. So not only we have a pandemic, we also have a rapidly aging population. So without immigration of doctors and nurses, we wouldn't be able to provide healthcare here in this country. So the benefits of immigration are, I think, obvious. The problem, Kislaya, is that there's always a politician that exploits the issue and that essentially creates or generates fear in people. And immigrants are an easy scapegoat. Like if something goes bad, you blame the foreigner, you blame the immigrant. And I think people like you and I, who know better, of course, we need to do a better job at persuading people, and that's why I included a few pages in the book, quite a few pages in the book about immigration, because I think it's going to be really important to engage in that attempt at persuading people that immigration is good for the economy, is good for the United States.
So in the chapter, you say that the emphasis of marketers on what millennials want happens to be misplaced, and that the most significant group, both in terms of numbers and purchasing power, are the graying or people growing older. And so talk about where we will be in 2030 and what opportunities this presents for businesses.
Yeah, so I have nothing against millennials. I mean, I have my two daughters are millennials, okay? But having said that, look, up until now, every generation of people was bigger than the preceding generation. So naturally, then brands, companies were paying a lot of attention to consumers in their 30s, in their 40s. That was the bulk of the market. But now moving forward, because of this process of population aging, we're going to see that first in Japan, then in China, after that in Europe, then in the US, Latin America, and the rest of the world, we're going to see that the largest consumer segment is going to be people above the age of 60. But look, I think a lot of people misunderstand the nature of that segment, because somebody who celebrates his or her 60th birthday today in the United States, and there's about 12,000 people today celebrating their 60th birthday. So happy birthday to them. Most of those people are still in very good mental and physical shape. So today, a 60-year-old or a 65-year-old or a 70-year-old is in so much better physical and mental shape than somebody of the same age, but 50 years ago, that we can no longer call them old. That's the problem. That's the old way of thinking about it, right? People now in that demographic, they still have a very active lifestyle. Many of them continue to work. They want to continue traveling. They want to do all of the things that they did when they were in their 40s and in their 50s. So I think a very large market is emerging there. And here's another statistic that I find very revealing, Islaya, which is that here in the United States, 80% of the net worth is owned by people above the age of 60. 80%. In other countries in the world, it's not as skewed. It's more like 60 to 70%. But that means that there's purchasing power potentially in that age group. So I think that this process of population, we call it aging, I think it's actually going to change consumer and financial markets beginning here in the United States very soon.
You actually, if I remember right, make an interesting connection with the success of Airbnb and the aging of the US population. And could you maybe expand on that?
Oh, absolutely. Look, Airbnb is a fantastic platform. And as you know, it has actually weathered the pandemic really well. I mean, think about the travel industry. It's completely devastated by the pandemic. Airbnb went public in December, right? And the price of the share actually went up. And that's because Airbnb knew how to reinvent itself during the pandemic. But I think originally, the big insight that the founders of Airbnb had was that you had two generations at that point in time. I'm talking about 10 or 15 years ago. You had millennials who dislike hotels, who dislike banks, who dislike owning a car, all of those things on the one hand. So people who would like to experience travel in a different way. And then you have another generation of people who have space in their home because they're empty nesters, because they also perhaps need a little bit more money because their retirement fund didn't do as well in the market as they thought. They're willing to rent some of that space or even an entire space when they, for example, visit family to people. So you had those separate generations. What we needed was a digital platform that would enable those two generations to get together and to engage in what we now call the sharing economy. So I think that's the absolutely terrific insight that the founders of Airbnb had that nobody else did. And that's why today they're billionaires, because they understood that there was that differential situation between the two generations.
So I'll turn to the chapter, Keeping Up with the Sings and the Wangs. and you discuss what is happening with the middle class around the world and what the middle class will look like in 2030. But before we talk about that, I was wondering if you could expand on what is the middle class and why is it so important? I found that discussion in that chapter very interesting.
Yeah, so look, Kislaya, I think the best way of describing the middle class is that it's a state of mind, right? Being middle class is being different. And it's all about, I think, knowing that you have some economic security, right? Knowing that you can send your kids to a good school, knowing that you can take a vacation, knowing that you will be able at some point when you can no longer work or no longer want to work, you'll be able to retire. That's the middle class. Now, how exactly we define it empirically, that's another matter. But it's a state of mind. But it just so happens that the middle class is absolutely central to the market economy. Because as you know, consumption, domestic consumption, is now 60, 70, even 75% of the economy in many countries around the world, both advanced economies or mature economies like the US or the UK or France, but also in emerging markets like India, right? The domestic consumption represents a very large proportion of total gross domestic product. So if the middle class is growing, that means the economy probably has a lot of potential. But as you know, over the last 30 years or so, the middle class in Europe and the United States has stagnated. And at the same time, the middle class in emerging markets like China, India, Thailand, Turkey has expanded, not just in terms of the number of people who are middle class, but also their average income. And so those economies are on a roll. They're growing, and everybody likes the potential there because the middle class could even grow bigger. Whereas, once again, on both sides of the North Atlantic Ocean, what we're seeing is stagnation.
So from the point of view of businesses, what do you think would be the implications of this shift in the center of gravity of the global middle class to
So let me point out
Asia?
Let me point out two implications because I think there's many. One of them has to do with brands. So for the last 100 years or so, brands have thought about new products, about new services, with the European and the American consumer in mind, right? And as you know, many of the theories in international business, many of the theories in the field of management actually make that assumption, right? And so moving forward, I think brands will have no choice if they want to be truly global, to pay more attention to the Asian consumer. And of course, when I say Asian consumer, that's very heterogeneous, right? I mean, the Indian consumer is very different from the Chinese consumer. Even within India, as you know better than I do, there are all sorts of variations and cultural differences, and of course, linguistic differences and so on and so forth. So I think increasingly what we're going to see is that brands, and I think it's going to be tough for some of them, they want to be able to say, okay, we're going to design new products and services just keeping in mind our idea of the American consumer. That's no longer going to be possible because the most successful brands will be the ones that are flexible enough or versatile enough to be able to cater to the needs of all of these different kinds of consumers around the world. So I think that's one very big implication of this. The other big implication, of course, is, look, the nature of global competition. The largest markets will be China and India. So we shouldn't be surprised if Indian companies and Chinese companies are going to be among the biggest in the world because naturally they will have a big market share in their home market. And then many of them already have expanded abroad. So they're going to be the largest companies in the world. I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years from now, we see that in the global 500 ranking of the largest companies in the world, that we actually have more companies from China and India than from Europe and the United States combined. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Moving on, so I was very struck by the observation that women are accumulating wealth now faster than men. And, the interesting statistic you have that by 2030, more than half the world's wealth will be owned by women. And what's behind this enhanced economic status of women?
Yeah, so Kislaya, I believe this is the biggest trend and the one that is going to have the largest impact. And let me explain why. So the reason why women are accumulating wealth faster than men is because now women in more countries around the world have better access to education. And if they have better access to education, what happens, as you know, is that they stay in school, then they go to college, they postpone having babies, they pursue a career. Maybe later on they have one baby or two at most, but that's about it. And so they're making their own money. And look, this is a statistic that I find absolutely telling. Right now, as we speak, in 41% of American households where there is a man and a woman married to each other, in 41% of those cases, the woman makes more money than the man. Okay? And the forecast by the US Bureau of the Census is that by the year 2030, okay, so once again, we go back to that year, more than half of those households will have a woman who makes more money than the man for the first time in history, right? So the implications of this, look, consumer markets are going to change, but it's not going to be so much in terms of beauty products and those kinds of things. It's services. You see, women, if they have money in their pockets, they're more willing to spend more on healthcare, on education, on insurance. They care more about the future than on average men do. But I think it's also going to change financial markets and the world of investing, because let's not forget the statistics about, for example, asset allocation in pension funds, or the experiments that our colleagues conduct in terms of having men and women make decisions about what to do with their money, show that women are more risk averse when it comes to investing their money. They're also less likely to do something that is really bad for long-term performance of your investments, which is that they stick to their choices. Men are more likely to change their investments more frequently, which, as you know, is actually not a very good strategy over the long run, right? So that's what's driving it. What's driving it is that women have better access to opportunities. They have more of a presence in the labor market. And they are different on average as consumers and as investors. So as a result, consumer markets and also financial markets are going to change.
But it's not all a rosy story as well. I mean, you speak also of diverging fortunes of women based on a variety of factors.
Oh, absolutely.
Well.
Absolutely. I was talking in average terms. Thank you for reminding me about that. So, for example, here in the United States, as I document in the book, there are three groups of women who are having a very tough time. I mean, one is teenage mothers, okay? Another one is just in general, more broadly, single mothers, okay? And the third group is divorced women. Contrary to the popular, wisdom that women make a lot of money when they get a divorce, that's not really the case. It's only in very specific cases involving billionaires, right? Normally, what we see 5 years after a divorce or 10 years after a divorce is that women are actually worse off financially than if they were married. And let's not forget, and this is something that coming from Spain really struck me when I first came here to the United States, slightly more than half of all first marriages in the United States end up in divorce. Slightly more than half, right? So this is something that affects a lot of women out there. And once again, they tend to suffer negative consequences from that.
So do you think all of this economic empowerment means that we can be optimistic that we'll have true gender equality by 2030?
Well, I think progress is being made, but perhaps not fast enough. So as we know, or as you know, yes, women now have better access to education. In fact, in American colleges, there's more women than men now, right, as you know. But then it seems as if once they start working, there are a number of things that prevent women from becoming, for example, top executives. We have very few CEOs, as you know, in the United States, especially among the largest firms. So there's a number of obstacles that then women encounter. For example, the motherhood penalty, right? The fact that many of them, they decide to have children, and that makes it harder for them to continue with their careers. And that is also pay discrimination, as the Me Too movement, other types of discrimination, as the Me Too movement brought to our attention so powerfully a few years ago. So I completely agree that there's still obstacles, there's still discrimination and all of that. But I think it's also at the same time undeniable that women today play a role in the economy that is just completely different from the one that they used to play 20 or 30 years ago.
So we'll turn to the subject of cities now. So every time I'm in New Delhi, I think of the city of my childhood with wide open streets, sometimes even empty streets. And now, whenever I'm back there, it's teeming with people at any time of day or night. And many more are added almost every day as this migration that's been going on just continues. And will this trend in the growth of cities continue? And what's the implication of that, both good and bad?
Yeah, so let me make or give you an answer both before the pandemic and after the pandemic, because I think a lot of people are asking themselves as to whether this particular trend will be reversed by the pandemic because people no longer have to live downtown given remote work. So before the pandemic, what was very clear is that cities were growing extremely fast. Every week that passes, that was passing before the pandemic, about 1.5 million additional people were living in cities in the world. And look, I mean, just 40 years ago, there were only two cities in the world, three cities in the world with more than 10 million people. And New Delhi wasn't one of them, right? Those three cities were New York, Tokyo, and Osaka. But now we have more than 30 cities with more than 10 million people, and New Delhi, as well as Mumbai and Kolkata, is one of them, right? So cities are growing really quickly, especially in South Asia, including India, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what's going to happen with the pandemic? So I can perfectly see how some people here in the United States, now that they have remote work available to them, may decide to move outside of the downtown area. Or if they already live in the suburbs, then instead of living only 15 miles from downtown, they will now move further out. They will get more space for the same money. And, why not? So I think that may happen in Europe, in the United States. It may happen in some European countries. But quite frankly, I don't see that happening in India. I don't see that happening in China. I don't see that happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think in those parts of the world, this process of the growth of cities will continue. And by the year 2030, by the way, we're going to have more than 70% of the world's population living in cities. And so that's going to continue changing the face of the economy and also, our lives, right? Because life in the city is very different from life in the small town.
Yeah, well, one way I feel it's different is that you have this the starkness of the inequality that you see in cities, and the other is that the effect on the environment you see in a much more concentrated way, possibly than you might see, in rural areas. And so, those are two things you talk about quite a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you're putting your finger on something that I think is extremely important, which is that cities are great. They offer opportunity, but not everybody who moves to the city can take advantage of that. And so, as you said, these cities have become an engine of inequality. I mean, we see such stark contrasts here in the United States. I mean, New York City has some of the wealthiest areas in the world within its boundaries, but at the same time, also some of the poorest. The other issue that I think is important is, you also mentioned, cities occupy only 1% of the land in the world. Right now, they're home to about maybe 60% of the population, but cities account for 80% of all the carbon emissions in the world. And so, unless we somehow make cities more efficient in the use of energy, unless we persuade consumers in the cities that they have to be less wasteful, I think it's going to be very difficult to deal with all of the environmental problems that we have: climate change, the crisis of not enough water, and also plastic contamination, which, as you know, is a really, really serious problem now in the world. So yeah, I think we need good ideas. We need entrepreneurs. We need good managers to help us make cities more efficient, more livable, and above everything else, more environmentally friendly.
Yeah, and you suggest that maybe just nudges can do that. And I like the phrase you have there, the mundanity of excellence that you talk about. Could you maybe expound on that?
Yeah, so I think we should continue to invest in new technologies. For example, to liberate ourselves from fossil fuels. We should continue to ask our governments to come to agreements as to regulations, global regulations, like to slow down the rate of climate change. But then I think you and I, as consumers, we also have a responsibility. And look, here in the United States, it's mind-boggling, right? The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that 30% of the food that reaches our table goes wasted. 30%. But as I document in the book, the agricultural sector, including the use of fertilizers, including growing cattle, including the transportation of the food, is the single most important contributor to carbon emissions in the world. And yet we waste 30% of it, right? Of the food. So as consumers, I think we need to change. And that's why I introduced a concept that was developed by Daniel Chambliss, a sociologist, of the modality of excellence, that sometimes very small adjustments in our behavior, when everybody does it, can have huge impacts in the aggregate. And so if I try to save a little bit more of the resources that I consume, and I am not alone, many other people also do the same thing, I think that can be, or can eventually become, a very important contributor to our effort in terms of slowing down climate change.
In the chapter, and I love the title of this chapter, "More Cell Phones Than Toilets." And again, coming from India, this is a problem that resonates with me. You write of the power of technology to tackle some of our most pressing global problems. And these, you point out, will have become even more intractable by 2030. They're intractable today, but even worse then. And so, can you give us the example of maybe the headline of your of the chapter, but maybe some of the others as well?
Yeah, so the chapter "More Cell Phones Than Toilets" is precisely what you said, that especially in South Asia, what we see is that many people don't have access to a toilet connected to the sewer, which is the kind of thing that we assume that we have in the United States or in Europe, right? But they do have access to a cell phone. There are cell phone towers in their neighborhood, and they can communicate. And I think that speaks volumes about the priorities. People today feel that being connected is so much more important than having access to a toilet, right? And I think that's important because I do strongly believe that digital technologies, and in particular phones, have the potential to help us reduce poverty. Because as you know, in many cases, farmers, for example, in rural areas in Africa and South Asia, they have trouble securing the fertilizers that they need, or they have trouble securing other inputs like seeds. And they also have trouble, if they have a surplus, selling that surplus in the market because they don't have access to it, they don't have information about the prices. Not only that, now with your phone in many parts of Africa, as a farmer, you can purchase weather insurance, right? So I believe that this interconnectivity that you and I like, of course, because we are constantly in touch with the people we care about, and also with the news, and that we can do research using digitized databases and so on and so forth, and collaborate with other people around the world. But for farmers, for example, poor farmers in Sub-Saharan Africa, and let's not forget, 70% of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa still lives off the land, right? I mean, they're farming, getting into farming. It's completely liberating. This technology is liberating because they're isolated. The nearest bank is 2 hours away by bus. The nearest doctor is also 2 hours away by bus. But cell phones with telemedicine, with microcredit, enable them to prosper. And so I think it's just that we're going through a big revolution. And we're only seeing the beginning of this, right? I think we're going to see so much change in this respect.
Some other examples that you mentioned was sort of robotic surgery, 3D printing, virtual reality, Internet of Things, and I don't know if you all-weather garments, nanotech. So maybe if you could elaborate on some other examples.
Absolutely. I am a big believer in 3D printing. I think 3D printing will help, especially isolated communities, be able to secure what they need through local printing. Virtual reality, you mentioned. 10 years ago, I thought virtual reality was only for video games. That was the only application of virtual reality. But now I think in the age of remote work, I think virtual reality is going to make these platforms so much more useful if they incorporate that kind of technology. But the other area is healthcare. I mean, so many applications of virtual reality. For example, as a therapy for people who suffer from autism, okay? Or as a therapy for people who suffer from dementia. So what we're seeing increasingly, and I think this is extremely important moving forward, is that these technologies that we thought were only for fun are now finding applications, right, in so many different fields that matter, fields that essentially promise to increase our quality of life. And I think that's what technology should do, right? What technology should do is increase our quality of life, open up new possibilities for us. And I believe that these technologies that you mentioned, but especially 3D printing and virtual reality, in addition to AI, in addition to big data, all of those other things, they have, I think they're going to have enormous potential in the world.
On AI, I actually liked your example. Since there's so much talk these days of ethical AI, and you had this example of how ethics in different countries in the world is different, and resolving that into ethical artificial intelligence is a very difficult problem. And I thought that gave a really whole interesting new dimension to some of the AI issues that you mentioned. So I'll turn to, and I'm keeping track of the time, and I do want to make sure the audience has full time for questions, but I will ask you about the chapter, Imagine No Possessions. And you write in that, by 2030, the number of things we may share, homes, cars, and jobs may well be nearly endless. And we see that jobs are being broken up into tasks. People get fractional access to property like homes and automobiles, and they can invest in risky projects without intermediaries. So we've all experienced both some of the benefits as well as some of the downsides of the collaborative economy. So in 2030, where do you see the collaborative economy, and do you think it's going to make the world a better place?
Yes, the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, through all of these digital platforms that we've been talking about, I think it's gonna, change quite a few things. I mean, we're already seeing in terms of urban transportation, we're seeing in terms of travel and accommodations with the example of Airbnb, but I think it will go well beyond that. I think, for example, remote work and the gig economy, right? All of these independent contractors, people who go to TaskRabbit, and they make money by taking on jobs, that are not, full-time jobs that require you to be at the office from 8 to 5, but rather specific tasks that you need to complete. But more importantly, let me go back to the issue of how wasteful we are as consumers. I think that if we use these digital platforms to a greater extent, for example, to create more second-hand markets, more pre-owned vehicle markets, more, recycling, I think it would be great. And when it comes to food, by the way, there are digital platforms that are trying to promote sharing the food that we're about to throw into the trash can within our cities, right? Because once again, we waste so much of it. So yes, I think the sharing economy has the potential of revolutionizing everything. And by the way, the biggest implication of all would be what happens when we have fewer people owning assets and increasingly those people sharing assets. Because as you know, the market economy for the longest time has been built on the assumption that people have property, right? You own a house, you own a machine that helps you make other things, you own a shop. So what happens when ownership doesn't become the central feature of the market economy? I think that's a really important question for the near future.
So I have three short questions on that. One is, will this make the world more or less unequal?
Could you repeat the question again? I was distracted by a noise.
Will this make the world more or less unequal, or related to that, will jobs as we know them disappear?
So I apologize, Kislaya, again. Could you repeat the question? Yeah,
sure,
there was a noise that was bothering me. Sorry.
Yeah, so,
On my end.
Not at all. Will this make the world more or less unequal, and also will it make jobs disappear as we know them?
Yeah, well, look, I think the two questions are interrelated. I think we have more inequality because we're finding ourselves in a situation in which some people lose their jobs and they cannot find another job that pays as well. And that's because of technological change, sometimes because of free trade. But technological change is essentially making certain kinds of skills redundant or obsolete. And so I think the two issues are so related. In fact, I think they are the two sides of the same coin, that we need to deal with them simultaneously. And we need to make a bigger effort than the one that we've made over the last 20 years in terms of ensuring that nobody's left behind. I think the fundamental problem that we've made or that we've created for ourselves is to just simply assume that if people would lose their job because of technological change, because of automation, that they would be able to find some other job. But that's not as easy as that. When people are in their 50s, for example, it's difficult for them to move from one city to another. When people are in their 50s, they have less of a motivation to learn or to acquire a new skill. And so this has created many problems, I think, in Europe, here in the United States, both economic problems, but also political problems. So I hope that moving forward, we pay more attention to this issue and we make every effort not to leave anybody behind.
My last question before we turn to the audience, and which is, what would be your tips and tricks to survive 2030 or to prepare for 2030?
Yeah, so in the book, I mentioned 7 tricks, as you said. Mm-hmm. And of course, I could spend the next half hour just going through each of those tricks, but let me summarize it, or let me boil them down into 2 basic principles, okay? So the first is, and it applies to both companies and individuals, we have to come to terms with the reality that things are changing very quickly. You see, there's a lot of people who are thinking, oh, this will pass, right? And we're going to go back to the good old days, to the golden age. And look, that is impossible. There's no turning back. You cannot turn the clock of history back. So the first thing that we need to do is, as companies, as organizations, as individuals, is accept that change is going on. And then the second thing is, you need to make decisions. You cannot wait until the year 2030, until everything has already changed. Companies and individuals need to start making decisions now. And here's one of the principles that I explain in the book, for me, the most important one, which is never make a decision as you try to adapt to these new circumstances that is irreversible. Every decision that you make has to enable you to engage in course correction. Because if you make decisions that are irreversible, and then things turn out in a way that you did not anticipate, then you're going to find yourself against the wall or in a corner. So it's extremely important to keep your options open. As you know, a very famous theory in finance is options theory. And look, the value of a financial option increases with uncertainty. And so does, I think, the value of a real option. So as I make decisions today, I want to keep my options open for the future, because given that so many things are changing, maybe I will need to exercise some of those options. So never make an irreversible decision. That's my second piece of advice.
Thank you. So let's turn to some questions from the audience. And I think the earliest one that came in today was from Raj, who says, Africa is a very exciting place. So which industries do you think will take off there by 2030?
So which economies in particular?
Which industries?
Oh, industries. Oh, look. The first thing that I think is going to happen in Africa is there's going to be an agricultural revolution. Because as you know, the yields, the productivity of African agriculture is really low. I mean, it's, like 10% or even less than what it is, for example, in California, which has one of the most productive agricultural sectors in the world. And so the sky is the limit, right? I mean, people look at those statistics on productivity in Africa and they say, oh, what a disaster. I actually look at it and I say, oh my goodness, there's so much room for improvement. So all we need to do is give the farmers the means, right? We need to give them the cell phones. We need to give them the seeds, the fertilizers, the information, so that they can become more sophisticated at what they do. So I believe there's going to be, first, a revolution in agriculture. There's also going to be a big revolution in terms of the processing of those foodstuffs, and that's already part of manufacturing, the food processing industry. But then let's not forget, the other example I would put is education. There's going to be a big boom in education in Africa, because between now and the year 2030, nearly 400 million babies will be born in Africa. And you know what? They don't have the time to build the schools. They're going to have to use remote learning. They're going to have to use all of these digital platforms that now we seem to be using in some other parts of the world out of necessity because of the pandemic. But in Africa, that's going to be the way they're going to do it. The same way that, if you remember, they never built enough ATMs or bank branches. They went directly to mobile payments, right? And the same way that they also are using telemedicine to a much greater extent than we do here in the United States, for example. So I believe that, again, as I said, agriculture, food processing, and then education and all of the other related service industries, I think there's going to be a big boom in Africa.
I'll turn now to one of the questions that was submitted by people who registered. Actually, there were several questions on cryptocurrencies, and I'll pick one out of those, which said, what role will cryptocurrencies play in the future? Are they a fad or the next primary currency of the future?
Yeah, so first, I think cryptocurrencies are an amazing innovation. Now, the problem is that governments, central banks, they don't want to lose control over the printing of money. They don't want to lose control over monetary policy. And perhaps it would be good for us that they didn't lose control over interest rates. Because just imagine during this pandemic, without the Federal Reserve, I mean, the American economy would be dead by now. I mean, the Federal Reserve was ready to act and they acted. So I think the future of cryptocurrencies, however, is going to be a little bit more complex than just cryptocurrency. I think what's going to happen is that we're going to move into a world in which we're going to have digital tokens. And those digital tokens will be primarily about smart contracts. So for example, I book a room at a hotel that gets recorded into my digital token, onto the blockchain eventually. Or I sign a tuition contract with a school that I'm attending. Or I sign a contract to work for a company. Or perhaps I purchase a home. All of those things can be implemented on the blockchain as smart contracts. And we can also add cryptocurrency as part of that. And we could also include discounts. We could include all sorts of things. That, I think, is the future. It's a bundle of services, including cryptocurrency, but not only cryptocurrency. I think that's the future. And if we move more towards those digital tokens, I think central banks and governments are going to see that the efficiency in the economy will increase. They're going to see the transaction costs go down. And so they're going to be a little bit more favorable towards those innovations.
So we have a question from Ritu Agarwal. You spoke about increasing wealth. You spoke about the increasing wealth and advancement for women in the race to digitization, and as technology pervades all aspects of society and economic systems, will women experience adverse outcomes as a result of digital disparities? Yeah,
no, that's a great question. And it is true that there is a gender digital divide in the world. There's also an income digital divide, meaning that wealthier people and wealthier countries, of course, have better access. They have better Wi-Fi. They have better devices, and so on and so forth. But specifically about the gender issue, this is something that I find very surprising. That the gender gap not only exists in developing countries or emerging markets, where not all women yet have access to education. It also happens in the United States or in Europe. And I mentioned at the beginning that now we have more women than men in college, attending college. But having said that, there's still this digital gap. So I think, simply put, we need more effort being put into eliminating all of these gaps, not just the gender one, but also any gap that has to do with ethnicity or with race, with income level. Because at the end of the day, I mean, information and access to information now in the 21st century is almost as important, perhaps even more important, than access to oil during the 20th century, right? So, it's really discouraging to see that, as the question was asking about, that women across the board around the world have, are experiencing this digital gap, and it's something that I think we need to address.
And as your book has taught me, one should also view that as an opportunity to expand the digital access for women. So we also had several questions on the skills and also the academic majors that will be in demand in the future.
Oh boy.
So I'll pick a question for you. What are some of the best majors, areas of study for the future? Could this be data analytics or supply chain management, or are they just likely to be automated?
Yeah, so let me tell you, and I know that this is going to be controversial, okay, but I have the data on my side. And the data have been collected by particularly economists at MIT and at Stanford. And they show that in the American economy, the number of jobs that require what we call technical skills is going to continue growing, okay? It's going to be there. But by far, the highest growth will be in jobs that require social skills. For example, the ability to negotiate, the ability to work in teams, the ability to work in virtual teams, in remote work. And so much so that this is what I'm going to say, okay? Artificial intelligence. Machines in the future are going to program other machines. So, Kislaya, I don't understand why so many people want to major in computer science. I simply don't understand it, okay? Because, unfortunately, I believe that in 5-10 years from now, many of those people are going to find themselves out of a job because machines are going to be programming themselves. We will still need computer science majors, don't get me wrong, but not as many, I believe, as we are producing. I was very happy, for example, when one of my daughters was thinking about majoring in computer science and then she switched to math, because that's where I'm going. I think the skills, the most valuable skills in the future will be, in addition to social skills, such as the ability to negotiate or work in teams, is skills that help you learn. Because whatever you learn today is going to become obsolete very quickly, given technological change. But if you have the ability to acquire new knowledge very quickly, that is going to be really helpful. So what are those skills? It's very easy. Writing, reading, and math. Those, for me, are the 3 basic skills. So choose a major that helps you develop those skills, because they're going to be really important in the future. So once again, writing, reading, and math. So the humanities, they're great because they help you become a good reader and a good writer. The science is great, mathematics. We're going to need a lot of managers, but we're going to need managers who are flexible, who know how to work in teams, who know how to negotiate, and managers who can acquire new knowledge. So also the managers that we train at business schools, we need to help them be very good with numbers, of course, but also very good with words.
Great, thank you. I don't believe we have time for more questions, so I just want to take my last minute here to thank you so much for coming. And first, the opportunity to read your book, which I found really excellent, and then spending this hour with us and our students. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kislaya. And let me just add one thing, which is that I've used research coming out of the University of Maryland for the book. I mean, if you examine the sources. So it's reciprocal. I also admire very much the research that you and your center and other units, other departments within your campus has been producing. Very helpful, very useful research.
Thank you.